She was 22 and homeless. Not a cent in the bank, not a person to call, nothing but a backpack and $10 she'd been saving for a week. And somehow she spent every dollar of it on a rusted railroad car sitting abandoned at the end of a dead track in the hills of West Virginia. People said she was out of her mind. They said the thing was scrap metal, but what nobody knew was that inside that old railroad car, sealed behind a panel that hadn't been opened in over 45 years, was something that would change everything. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. May Boone came from the kind of family that didn't leave much behind. Not because they were bad people, but because they never had enough to leave. Her mother waitressed at a truck stop outside Charleston until her back gave out. Her father drove a delivery truck until the company went under. They lived in a trailer park off Route 60, the kind with gravel lots and chain-link fences and a laundromat at the entrance that was always broken. May shared a room with her younger sister until she was 16. Then her sister went to live with an aunt in Ohio, and May stayed because someone had to help her mother with the bills. She dropped out of school at 17 to work full-time. First at the truck stop where her mother used to work, washing dishes and bussing tables. Then at a convenience store on the edge of town, working the register from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. and stocking shelves from 2 to 6. She was good at it, the kind of good that comes from paying attention and not complaining, which is to say, the kind of good that rarely gets noticed and almost never gets rewarded. Her mother died when May was 20. Heart failure, the doctor said, which was the medical way of saying a lifetime of hard work and poor food and not enough rest had finally caught up. May buried her in the county cemetery with money she borrowed from the truck stop owner, a man named Hal, who let her pay it back $20 a month out of her paycheck. She paid it off in 9 months. On the day she made the last payment, she stood in Hal's office and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, emptiness. Like the debt had been the last thread connecting her to her old life, and now that it was cut, she was floating. The trailer was repossessed 2 months later. May came home from a shift and found a notice taped to the door. She had 3 days to vacate. She packed what she could into her backpack, left the rest, and walked to the Greyhound station in Charleston with $38 in her pocket and no destination in mind. She rode buses for a while, not going anywhere specific, just moving, the way people do when standing still feels worse than going nowhere. She slept in stations when she could, curling up on benches with her backpack under her head and her jacket pulled over her shoulders. She ate from vending machines and gas station hot bars, the kind of food that fills you up without feeding you, shrink-wrapped sandwiches and bags of chips and coffee that tasted like the machine it came from. She washed her face in rest stop bathrooms, leaning over sinks in fluorescent light, looking at herself in mirrors that were always streaked and always unflattering. She got good at being invisible, at taking up as little space as possible, at sitting in a corner with a book and looking like she was waiting for someone who was about to arrive. She had been doing this for 2 months. 2 months of motion without direction, 2 months of watching towns scroll past bus windows and wondering what it would feel like to stop. Not just stop moving, but stop being in between. To be somewhere, not on the way to somewhere, to unpack a bag and leave it unpacked. She had never done that in her life. Not at the trailer, not at any of the apartments before the trailer. Unpacking meant trusting that you would be allowed to stay, and May had learned early that trust like that was a luxury she couldn't afford. Besides, it was on a bus from Huntington to a town called Hinton that she overheard a conversation that changed the direction of her life. 2 men sitting in front of her were talking about a railroad salvage auction happening that weekend in Summers County. They were work boots and flannel types, the kind of men who knew about machines and metal and what things were worth by weight. The railroad had been selling off old equipment, decommissioned cars that had been sitting on dead spurs for decades. Most of it was scrap. But one of the men mentioned a passenger car, an old Pullman sleeper from the 1940s sitting on a short section of abandoned track outside a town called Talcott. Nobody had bid on it at the last auction. The railroad was letting it go for $10, just to clear it from the books. Whoever bought it got the car and the right to use the 200 feet of track it sat on, which belonged to a defunct rail company that no longer existed. $10. May leaned forward slightly. She didn't say anything. She just listened. The men talked about the car for a few more minutes. One of them said it was rusted through. The other said the interior was probably rotted out. They both agreed it wasn't worth the gas money to drive out and look at it. Then they moved on to talking about a football game, and the conversation was over. But for May, something had shifted. She sat back in her seat and looked out the window at the green hills rolling past. A railroad car. A place with walls and a roof and a door that locked. A place that sat still on a piece of track and didn't move. For someone who had spent 2 months in motion, the idea of a thing that stayed in one place felt almost unbearably appealing. When the bus pulled into Hinton, May got off. She found the county clerk's office in a building that smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. She asked about the railroad car. The clerk, a woman in her 40s with curly hair and a kind face, pulled up the listing on her computer. Pullman Standard Sleeper Car, built 1946, decommissioned 1978, currently located on an abandoned spur track approximately 2 miles east of Talcott, Summers County. Sold as is, minimum bid, $10. The clerk looked up at May. It's been listed for 8 months, no bidders. You interested? May set $10 on the counter. The clerk studied her for a moment. Not unkindly, but with the careful attention of someone who has seen a lot of hopeful people make a lot of questionable decisions. You know there's no road access to that spur? It's a mile walk from the nearest paved road. No electric, no water, no nothing. I understand, May said. The clerk typed something, printed a form, and slid it across the counter. Sign at the bottom. May signed. She walked to Talcott that afternoon. It took about an hour and a half from Hinton, following Route 3 along the New River, which ran wide and green through the valley between steep wooded hills. The road was quiet. A few trucks passed. A man on a tractor waved from a field. The air smelled like river water and warm pine and the faint metallic tang of old railroad iron. Hawks circled in the thermals above the ridgeline, small dark shapes turning slowly against the blue. She crossed a bridge over the New River and stopped in the middle to look down. The water was deep and clear and moving fast, dark green in the shadows and bright silver where it caught the sun. She could see rocks on the bottom, round and smooth, polished by 1,000 years of current. The bridge vibrated faintly under her feet from the water's force. She stood there for a few minutes, watching the river, feeling the bridge hum. There was something steadying about it. The river had been here before her, and would be here after her, and it didn't care about any of the things she was worried about. It just kept going. Talcott was barely a town. A post office, a church, a volunteer fire department, a handful of houses spread along the road. A historical marker at the edge of town mentioned something about John Henry and the Big Bend Tunnel. The legendary steel-driving man who had raced a steam drill through the mountain and won and then died with his hammer in his hand. May didn't stop to read it. She was looking for the spur track. She found it about a mile past town, where a gravel road turned off the main highway and wound through a stand of hickory and red oak, before ending at a rusty gate. The gate had a chain on it, but the chain was loose and the lock was broken. Beyond the gate, a narrow dirt path followed the old rail bed into the woods. The rails were still there, half buried in dirt and leaves, the ties rotting but holding their shape. Mushrooms grew along the edges of the ties. Ferns uncurled from between the rails. The path was so overgrown that in places she had to push through branches that had grown across it, the leaves brushing against her arms and face. May walked the path for about 10 minutes. The woods were thick on both sides, the canopy so dense that the afternoon light came through in green-gold shafts that shifted and swayed as the breeze moved the branches. Birds called in the upper branches. A squirrel ran along a fallen log and disappeared. The air was cool under the trees, 10 degrees cooler than the road, and it smelled like moss and leaf mold and something sweet she thought might be wild grape. Then she saw it. The railroad car was sitting on the last 200 feet of track, which ended at a rusted bumper stop overgrown with kudzu. It was longer than she had imagined, about 80 feet. A heavyweight Pullman sleeper with a rounded roof and riveted steel sides. The paint had once been dark green, the color of old money, but most of it had faded and peeled away, leaving patches of rust and bare metal. The windows ran in a long row down both sides, most of them intact, but clouded with decades of grime. At one end, a narrow vestibule door hung slightly open, its steps folded down into the weeds. May stood on the path and looked at it. The car sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees on 3 sides. The late afternoon light came through the canopy in long slanted beams, catching the dust and pollen in the air. The car was enormous and still and silent. It looked like something from another century, which it was. She walked through the weeds to the vestibule and climbed the narrow steps. The door was heavy, but it moved. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dim and narrow, a long corridor running the length of the car. On either side, compartments opened off the corridor, each one containing a bench seat that would have folded down into a sleeping berth. The upholstery was faded and torn, the fabric rotting in places, but the frames were solid. The walls were paneled in dark wood, mahogany or walnut, dulled by grime but not damaged. The floor was carpeted, the carpet worn to threads in the corridor but still intact in the compartments. The ceiling was arched, lined with more wood paneling with small brass light fixtures that had turned green with tarnish. It smelled like old wood and dust and something faintly metallic, the kind of smell that buildings get when they've been sealed up for a very long time. The air was still and cool, 20 degrees cooler than outside. May walked the corridor slowly, looking into each compartment. There were 12 sleeping sections in all, 6 on each side. At the far end of the car, past the last compartment, was a narrow door with a brass handle. She tried it. It was locked. She looked at the handle. It was different from the other doors. Heavier. The door itself was steel, not wood, and it was set into a steel frame that had been welded to the car's structure. It wasn't original to the car. Someone had added it later. May pulled at the handle again. The lock was a deadbolt, old but solid. She didn't have a key. She went back outside and walked around to the end of the car, looking for another way in. There was a window, small and high up, but it was sealed shut and covered from the inside with something dark. She went back inside and examined the door more carefully. The hinges were on the outside. They were heavy-duty, painted over, but the pins were accessible. She found a thin piece of rebar in the weeds outside the car, brought it back and used it to tap out the hinge pins, one at a time, working carefully so she wouldn't damage the frame. It took her almost an hour. When the last pin came free, she pulled the door away from the frame and leaned it against the corridor wall. Behind the door was a room she hadn't expected. It was the rear section of the car, about 15 feet long, completely enclosed. The windows had been covered with steel plates welded to the frame from the inside, which is why they were dark from outside. The room was lit only by the light coming through the open doorway behind her. And it was full. Wooden shelves ran along both walls, floor to ceiling. On the shelves, arranged in neat rows, were cigar boxes. Dozens of them. Maybe 100. Each one was a different brand. Different color, different size, but they were all stacked carefully, labels facing out, organized with obvious care. May picked up the nearest box and opened it. Inside were tightly rolled bundles of paper money, held together with rubber bands that had dried and cracked with age. She opened another box. More money. Another. This one held coins, old silver dollars, heavy and smooth. Another held folded stock certificates. Another held gold coins in small felt pouches. May sat down on the floor. The light from the doorway fell across the shelves in a warm rectangle. Cigar boxes everywhere she looked, stretching from one end of the hidden room to the other. She counted for 3 hours. She sat on the floor of that sealed steel room and opened every box one by one and counted what was inside. Some boxes held a few $100s. Some held thousands. The coins were old, silver and gold, and even without knowing their exact value, she could tell they were worth more than their face value. Much more. The total in paper currency came to $38,400. The coins in gold she couldn't value precisely, but she would later learn they were worth another $14,000. The stock certificates were from companies that no longer existed, worthless as investments, but interesting as artifacts. At the bottom of the last shelf, tucked behind a row of cigar boxes, she found a metal lunchbox, the old-fashioned kind with a rounded top and a clasp. Inside the lunchbox was a folded letter and a black-and-white photograph. The photograph showed a man standing beside the railroad car. He was in his 50s or 60s, lean, wearing overalls and a railroad cap, his face lined and sun-darkened. Behind him, the car was freshly painted, the dark green sharp and clean, the windows clear. He was smiling slightly, one hand resting on the side of the car, like he was leaning on something he trusted. The letter was handwritten on lined paper in blocky, careful capitals. "My name is Earl Boone. I worked for the C&O Railroad for 37 years. Brakeman, then conductor, then yard supervisor. When the line shut down, in '78, I bought this car with my severance pay, $50. They were glad to get rid of it. I have been saving money in this car since 1978. I do not trust banks. My father lost everything in 1933, and I never forgot it. This money is what I earned and saved honest. If anyone from my family finds this, they should know I never forgot about them. I had a son named Robert who left home in 1972. I do not know where he went. If he has children, they are my blood, and this belongs to them. Earl Boone, Talcott, West Virginia, March, 1998. May read the letter 3 times. Then she turned it over and read it again. Robert Boone. Her father's name was Robert. Robert Boone. He had left when he was young and never talked about where he came from. He had driven a delivery truck and lived in a trailer park, and never once mentioned a father or a railroad or a town called Talcott. Earl Boone was her grandfather. May sat in the dark, sealed room at the end of a rusted railroad car in the hills of West Virginia and cried. Not quietly, not politely, but the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep you didn't know it was there until something broke it open. She cried for the grandfather she had never met, for the father who had left home at 17 and never looked back, for her mother who had worked herself to death, for the trailer on Route 60 and the county cemetery and the Greyhound stations and all the places she had been that were never home. And she cried because Earl Boone, a man she had never known existed until 5 minutes ago, had spent 20 years putting money into cigar boxes in a railroad car for someone he wasn't sure would ever come. He had hoped. He had waited. He had written a letter and put it in a lunchbox and tucked it behind the last row of boxes on the bottom shelf. And then he had died, and the car had sat here in the woods for another 25 years, silent and sealed and full of everything he had saved. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever discovered something about your family that changed how you see your own life? The next morning, May walked back into Hinton and deposited the paper money at the bank. The teller counted it twice. May opened a savings account and a checking account and walked out into the sunlight feeling like she was wearing someone else's shoes. Everything felt different. The air, the light, the way the ground felt under her feet. She had entered the bank as a homeless person with a backpack. She walked out as someone with $38,400 in the bank and a railroad car in the woods and a grandfather's letter in her pocket. She bought a used truck that afternoon, a 2001 Ford F-150 with a camper shell, $3,400 from a man in Hinton who was selling it because his knees had gotten too bad to climb in. It had 152,000 miles and a tape deck in the dashboard that still worked. She drove it back to the gravel road near Talcott and parked it at the gate. For the first 2 weeks, she lived in the truck. She drove into town each morning for supplies and then walked the path to the railroad car to work. The first thing she did was open the car up. She pried open the sealed windows one at a time, pulling off the steel plates from the inside with a pry bar and letting light into the hidden room for the first time in decades. She opened every window in the corridor. She propped the vestibule doors open at both ends and let the mountain air blow through the length of the car, carrying out the stale air and the dust and the smell of 45 years of silence. She cleaned the interior over the next 10 days. She swept the corridor and the compartments. She pulled up the rotted carpet and found hardwood flooring underneath, tongue and groove oak that was dirty but undamaged. She scrubbed the mahogany wall panels with Murphy oil soap and soft cloths, working one section at a time, watching the dark wood come back to life under her hands, the grain appearing like something rising to the surface of deep water. The brass light fixtures she removed and soaked in vinegar and salt until the green tarnish dissolved, and the brass glowed warm and gold. The first month was structural. She hired a welder from Hinton to inspect the undercarriage and the steel frame. The car was built to last, heavyweight Pullman construction, and the frame was solid despite the surface rust. The welder patched a few spots on the floor where moisture had eaten through and reinforced the vestibule steps with new angle iron. He charged her $900 and told her the car was sound. She insulated the walls and ceiling with rigid foam board, cutting each piece to fit the curved interior and gluing it in place with construction adhesive. Over the foam, she mounted thin plywood paneling that she stained to match the original mahogany. The insulation changed the car completely. The steel shell that had been freezing cold at night and burning hot in the afternoon became stable and quiet. The drafts stopped. The condensation stopped. The car felt like a building instead of a vehicle. The second month was plumbing and electric. She ran a water line from a spring she found about 400 yards uphill from the car. Using PVC pipe buried in a trench, she dug by hand over 5 days. The spring was strong and clean, coming out of a limestone ledge beneath a stand of hemlocks. She installed a small water tank on a platform she built beside the car, gravity-fed from the spring, and ran lines to a kitchen sink and a small bathroom she built in one of the sleeping compartments. For electric, she started with a generator and then, on the advice of a man she met at the hardware store in Hinton, installed a small solar panel system, 4 panels on a rack beside the car, and a battery bank beneath the car in a weatherproof box. It wasn't a lot of power, but it was enough for lights, a phone charger, and a small refrigerator. The sleeping compartments she converted one at a time. She tore out the old rotted berths and rebuilt them using pine lumber and new upholstery foam wrapped in canvas. Each compartment became a small self-contained room, just wide enough for a bed and a narrow shelf. She kept her favorite compartment for herself, the one closest to the rear of the car, where the window looked out into the trees. She hung a curtain across the doorway, put a reading lamp on the shelf, and lay on the new berth that first night listening to the sounds of the West Virginia woods. Crickets, a distant owl, the faint metallic tick of the car's steel frame cooling in the night air, the creak of the springs beneath her settling into a shape that fit. By the 4th month, the railroad car was a home. She had a kitchen in the center section, built into two of the compartments with the partition wall removed. Oars, a 2-burner propane stove, a sink with running spring water, a counter she made from a slab of cherry wood that a logger in Talcott gave her after she helped him repair a fence. She had a living area in the forward section, with a small wood stove she installed. Vented through a chimney pipe, she ran through the roof, the opening sealed with flashing and silicone. 2 armchairs she found at a yard sale in Hinton. A bookshelf made from old railroad ties she cut and sanded and stacked. She kept Earl's cigar boxes. She cleaned them and arranged them on a shelf above the kitchen counter, labels out, organized the way he had organized them. Some of them she used for storage now, holding tea bags, matches, small tools, packets of seeds. But she left 3 of them empty, the way he had left them, as a reminder that a container doesn't have to be full to have value. Sometimes the empty ones hold the most important thing of all, which is space for whatever comes next. The people of Talcott discovered her gradually. The postmistress noticed a change of address form come through. The volunteer fire chief saw smoke from the wood stove chimney on a cold morning and drove out to investigate, expecting a brush fire, finding instead a young woman with sawdust in her hair making coffee in a railroad car. Word spread the way it does in a town of 300 people, quickly and with embellishment. By the end of the first month, most of Talcott knew the story. Earl Boone's granddaughter had come home. The old-timers remembered Earl. A quiet man, they said. Kept to himself mostly. Worked the railroad his whole life, 37 years without missing a shift. Which was a record at the C&O yard in Hinton. Walked into town every Saturday morning for groceries and the newspaper, rain or shine, wearing the same railroad cap and the same canvas jacket. He'd buy coffee at the general store and sit on the bench out front and drink it slowly, watching the traffic on Route 3, which wasn't much. He'd nod at people who passed. Sometimes he'd say good morning. But he never talked about himself, never talked about his family, never mentioned a son or a grandchild or anyone waiting for him at home. People assumed he was just a solitary man who liked his own company. They didn't know he was a man who had lost something and never found a way to say so. He died in 2003, they told May. Heart attack, alone in his house on the edge of town. The house was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchen. And when they cleaned it out after he died, there was almost nothing in it. A bed, a table, a radio, and a closet full of railroad uniforms he had kept pressed and hung on hangers even though he hadn't worn them in 25 years. Nobody knew about the railroad car. Nobody knew about the money. Nobody knew about the letter in the lunchbox or the cigar boxes on the shelves or any of it. Earl had kept his secret the way he kept everything else, quietly, completely to the end. A woman named Opal, who was 87 and had lived in Talcott her entire life, brought May a casserole one afternoon and a photograph she had found in a drawer while looking for something else. The photograph was small, black and white, with scalloped edges and a crease down the middle where it had been folded, and it showed a man standing beside the railroad tracks near the Big Bend Tunnel. He was in his 50s or 60s, lean and weathered, wearing overalls and a railroad cap. Beside him, holding his hand and looking up at him, was a small boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old. The boy had dark hair and a serious face, and he was gripping Earl's hand with both of his, the way children do when they're in a place that feels too big and they need something to hold on to. "That's Earl," Opal said, "and that little boy is his son Robert. I took that picture myself, must have been 1970 or 71. Earl carried that boy everywhere. I never saw a man love a child so much." She paused. When Robert left, Earl didn't talk to nobody for a year. Not a word. He just went to work and came home and sat on his porch and looked at the road, like he was waiting for someone to come back up it. The boy was May's father. May put the photograph on the shelf beside Earl's letter and the lunchbox, She looked at it every morning while she made coffee. The grandfather, the father, the granddaughter. 3 generations connected by a railroad car and a handful of cigar boxes and a letter that said, "I never forgot about them." 3 people who had never been in the same room at the same time, but who were linked by something stronger than presence. By blood, by loss, by the stubborn human insistence on leaving something behind for someone you might never meet. One evening in October, May sat on the vestibule steps of the railroad car and watched the sun go down through the trees. The leaves were turning, the hills a patchwork of orange and red and gold, the color so intense it looked like the whole valley was on fire. The air was cool and smelled like wood smoke from her stove and fallen leaves and the faint iron tang of the old rails beneath her feet. She thought about Earl, a man who worked the railroad for 37 years and then bought a piece of it when they were done with him, who sat in this same car, in this same clearing, watching the same hills change color in the same October light, who put money into cigar boxes because he didn't trust banks, because his father had lost everything in 1933, because some lessons go deep enough to shape a whole life. She thought about what it means to save. Not just money, but something harder to name. Faith, maybe. The belief that someone will come, that the thing you're building or hiding or protecting will matter to someone, even if you never get to meet them. Earl had saved for 20 years for a family he didn't know existed. He had written a letter to a person he couldn't picture, folded it into a lunchbox, and put it on the bottom shelf behind the last row of cigar boxes. And then he had waited. And when the waiting was over, when there was nothing left to do but hope, he had died alone in a house on the edge of town and left everything to the dark. But the dark didn't keep it. That's the thing about the things we leave behind. They don't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone comes looking. Someone follows an overheard conversation on a bus, or a government listing on a website, or a hand-drawn map in an envelope. Someone walks down a dirt path into the woods and finds a door that no one else thought to open. And that's when the saving pays off. Not for the person who saved, but for the person who finds. The person who stands in the light of an open doorway and sees, for the first time, what someone they never knew had been keeping safe for them all along. May Boone was 22 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a rusted railroad car at the end of a dead track in the hills of West Virginia. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, what's the most meaningful thing someone has ever left for you? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.